Hello there. Welcome to CinePlot Recap. Today we are going to go through the American comedy movie Idiocracy. Idiocracy 2006 is a satirical sci-fi comedy directed by Mike Judge, director of Office Space, Beavis and Butthead. The movie stars Luke Wilson and Maya Rudolph as two average people who are put into hibernation for 500 years, only to wake up in a future where society has become incredibly dumb. The smartest person in the world is now just an average guy from the past. It was kind of a cult film at first, but over time people have pointed to it as eerily prophetic. A lot of its jokes about anti-intellectualism, corporate control, and mindless entertainment feel way too real now. Please sit back, relax, and let us walk you through the movie Idiocracy. In the year 2005, Joe Bowers was just about the most average man you could find. A completely unremarkable army librarian. He did his job with minimal enthusiasm, never excelling, never failing, just existing. It was this very mediocrity that made him the perfect candidate for a top-secret government experiment, the Human Hibernation Project. Plan was simple. Joe, along with a second test subject, would be frozen for 1 year to test the viability of long-term cryogenic sleep. His counterpart in the experiment, a prostitute named Rita, had been roped in through a shady deal between the military and her pimp Upgrade, who was more than happy to loan her out for a cut of the money. But things didn't go as planned. Not long after Joe and Rita were sealed in their hibernation pods, the officer in charge of the project was arrested in a corruption scandal, and the entire program was shut down and forgotten. Pods remained buried beneath a military storage facility, lost to time as years turned into decades and decades into centuries. By the year 2505, the world had changed drastically and not for the better. Civilization had crumbled under the weight of its own stupidity. Skyscrapers were in ruins, entire cities were drowning in mountains of garbage, and society was ruled by mindless consumerism. People had lost the ability to think critically, relying instead on corporations to tell them what to eat, drink, and believe. Language had deteriorated into a mix of crude slang, grunts, and brand names, and technology, despite being advanced, was used in the most absurdly inefficient ways imaginable. Then, one day, a massive garbage avalanche triggered by centuries of accumulated waste crashed into Joe's forgotten pod, dislodging it from its resting place. The door burst open, and Joe tumbled out onto the floor of an unfamiliar apartment. Groggy and confused, he had no idea he had just woken up 500 years in the future. Staggering outside, Joe found himself in a world that barely resembled the one he had left. Enormous advertisements covered every inch of every building, flashing obnoxiously bright colors and shouting nonsensical slogans. People walked around in tattered, futuristic-looking clothes adorned with corporate logos, sipping from giant plastic cups filled with what seemed to be a combination of soda and sludge. The air was thick with pollution, and the streets were filled with the sounds of blaring television screens, honking cars, and people screaming at each other in barely comprehensible sentences. Still dazed, Joe made his way to what he thought was a hospital, seeking help for his sudden headache and disorientation. Inside, he was met by a doctor, if you could even call him that, who wore a garish, branded uniform and spoke in a slow, stilted drawl. The medical equipment looked advanced, but it was operated by clueless staff who relied entirely on touchscreen prompts. The doctor scanned Joe with a device and delivered his diagnosis in the simplest terms possible. Joe quickly realized he was in trouble. When the doctor asked for his barcode tattoo, apparently the only form of identification anyone used in this time, Joe had no answer. The doctor, assuming he was an unregistered criminal, promptly called the authorities. Before Joe knew what was happening, he was arrested and taken to prison, where he was processed in an absurdly automated system that stamped a barcode onto his wrist and threw him into a cell. But if there was one advantage to being the only somewhat intelligent person in a world of idiots, it was that escaping from prison turned out to be laughably easy. When a guard instructed prisoners to line up in the exit line, Joe simply walked right out without anyone questioning him. Desperate for answers, he tracked down the only person he had encountered before his arrest, Frito Pendejo, the moronic, couch-bound man whose apartment he had crashed into earlier. Frito, a lawyer in name only, was watching television when Joe barged in, demanding to know what year it was. When Frito casually mentioned 2505, Joe nearly passed out from shock. Realizing that this world was beyond saving and that his only hope was to get back to his own time, Joe asked Frito if there was a way to travel back. To his surprise, Frito mentioned something about a time machine that supposedly existed somewhere in the country. Seeing an opportunity, Joe promised Frito an obscene amount of money, something like billions of dollars, if he would take him to it. Since no one in this era understood basic economics, Frito instantly agreed, dreaming of his future fortune. Meanwhile, Rita had also awakened from her hibernation pod, dumped unceremoniously into a landfill. Unlike Joe, she quickly adapted to her surroundings, realizing that men in this world were even dumber and more gullible than they had been in 2005. She effortlessly scammed her way through town, convincing men to give her money for her services while making vague promises that she had no intention of keeping. Eventually, she reunited with Joe, who explained the dire situation. Together, they set out to find the so-called time machine. However, their journey took an unexpected turn when Joe was identified by a government database as having the highest IQ in the country. Within hours, he was dragged before President Dwayne Elizondo Mountain Dew Herbert Camacho, a former professional wrestler and reality TV star who had somehow become the leader of the United States. Camacho, loud, aggressive, and barely coherent, introduced Joe to the nation as the smartest guy alive and immediately appointed him Secretary of the Interior. His mission? To fix the country's biggest problems: a failing economy, a food crisis, and relentless dust storms. And he had 1 week to do it. As Joe explored the causes of the nation's decline, he discovered a shocking revelation. Crops weren't growing because they were being watered with Brondo, an energy drink. When he asked why, people simply responded, "Because it's got electrolytes." No one could explain what electrolytes were, but they had been brainwashed to believe that Brondo was essential for plant life. In reality, it was poisoning the soil. Joe ordered the government to switch back to watering crops with actual water. What he didn't realize, however, was that Brondo was such a massive corporation that when its stock crashed due to declining sales, millions of people were laid off overnight. A furious mob, now jobless and hungry, blamed Joe for their misfortune and demanded his execution. President Camacho, eager to maintain his popularity, sentenced Joe to rehabilitation, which in this era meant a death match in a giant arena against a monstrous flame-spewing vehicle driven by a legendary executioner named Beef Supreme. Just as Joe was about to be crushed, Frito and Rita discovered that his water plan had actually worked. Crops were beginning to grow again. The news spread, and at the last moment, the crowd's anger turned to admiration. Camacho, ever the showman, immediately declared Joe a hero and promoted him to President of the United States. With no way back to his own time, Joe accepted his fate. He married Rita, and together they had the smartest children the world had seen in centuries. Frito became vice president, and though the world was still overwhelmingly stupid, Joe's leadership slowly nudged civilization in a better direction. But just when it seemed like things were looking up, back in 2005, a second cryogenic pod suddenly flickered to life. The door hissed open, and out stepped Upgrade, Rita's long-forgotten pimp, blinking in confusion at his new surroundings. The cycle of stupidity, it seemed, wasn't over just yet. And so, Joe Bowers, an utterly average man from 2005, became the smartest person in the world simply by waking up in a future where intelligence had collapsed. Though he had started out desperately trying to escape, he ultimately chose to stay and help rebuild a society that had lost its way. Under his leadership, things began to improve, however slowly, proving that even in the dumbest of times, a little common sense could go a long way. But as the cryogenic pod of upgrade hissed open, there was one undeniable truth: stupidity had a way of surviving. And as long as it did, the future of Idiocracy was never truly safe. Thank you for watching CinePlot Recap. Please like, subscribe, and click on the notification icon for more movie recap. See you on the next video.